The gig workforce is growing by leaps and bounds. Hi, everybody. Karen over here for TechRepublic. I'm glad today to be joined by James Christiansen. He is the VP CSO with Netscope. Thanks for being with me, James.
Hey, it's so nice to be here today, Karen.
Yeah, we talk about the gig workforce, and we're seeing so many people working, in such a different way now. And the problem with that is security becomes a big issue. Let's talk a little bit about, how big of an issue is this? Because again, the gig workforce is just growing exponentially.
Oh, it's crazy, Karen. And actually, that's what got me really interested in this subject, was the first time I looked at some of the stats. They were unbelievable. 52% of the participating are from the pandemic. So as people lost their jobs, they went to the gig workforce. What absolutely was stunning to me when I looked at greater than 90% of the US people polled said they would do a gig job. Well, that really has kind of two pieces to it. It means that if they're a gig worker, like let's say, you've got Uber workers working for Lyft, right? Direct competitors. At the same time, that's one thing. But when you get into the tech world and you have, maybe your employee is doing a gig, unbeknownst is going to go to a competitor. And so these stats are just shocking when I saw 90%. That means somebody I'm working with, the stats will say, is doing a gig job on the side. And we've always, kind of had side jobs, but never where the data was so prevalent and could be leaked out to industrial espionage, sensitive data. We'll go through, I think, probably some of the examples of the type of people, but it's that stat, 90% and 3x growth, 300% growth in this area. So
Right.
As you said, it is exploding. And
Yeah.
half the millennials use gig jobs. So
Yeah, significant numbers there, really, when you think about it, James. And the problems that can pose, again, as far as connectivity and security, and your people are vulnerable. Therefore, their companies are vulnerable.
right, yeah, absolutely. And it's the problem, of course, we've dealt with contractors for a long time, right? We've hired contractors. I even used to work for a contracting company, but that company I was a full-time employee of, and they made sure I had background checks, I had a secure laptop that I worked from, and they would make sure I never worked in a competitor space. Well, these are freelance workers. The gig economy is about freelance workers. And as these freelance workers go from, quote, gig to gig, that data can accidentally, when you look at the insider threat, because that's what we're talking about, is a new insider threat. In fact, it would be the most difficult one in my over 25 years that I will have faced, because it's even more difficult than normal insider because of the monitoring aspect. How do I detect them? And they can be in so many different roles. You can have an application developer, and I've got a great example of a real live case where a developer was doing a gig work. It's actually kind of a funny case, but they could be, market analysis. They're coming in to do pricing analysis for you. Well, you give them all your sensitive data. You might give them your top salesmen's names. You might give them, how much commissions they're earning to do their analysis. Well, if that data, then when they're finished with it, how do you know if it gets deleted? How do you know they might accidentally, like I said, there's the malicious insider, but then the non-malicious, where they just accidentally do something that discloses the data. In fact, that's probably more prevalent than the malicious insider. But there's all these different power workers. Even, I've done a number of investigations, cyber, security, legal investigations, and we'll bring in external legal counsel helping crunch the data. And that's very sensitive data that after that quote gig is done could actually be leaked out. So this is why it's so shocking, and it's why we absolutely need to talk about it more. I even turn to my global network and say, hey, what do you think about this? And what are the best ways of mitigating these risks that we've got?
Well, yeah, and that leads me, to my next obvious question. We know what the problem is. We know that it's prevalent. So what do we do about it?
Well, it's really first, I think, understanding, what is the gig worker kind of attributes. They're going to be here typically short term. They're not usually long-term contracts. In fact, some of the normal things we would do is background checks. Well, as you start to think about what do you do? Well, how do you do a background check on somebody? It takes 2 weeks to get a background check done, and they're only going to be here 2 weeks. So it's really first starts with understanding the culture of your company. One of the things that's always absolutely essential as a successful chief security officer is understanding the culture. Well, in this case, I think we've got to start with educating, the key executives. What is the gig worker? Why do they pose this threat they do? What kind of threats? And then we can talk about how to mitigate those things. But first, they've got to have, my first suggestion is you've got to have a policy within your company about, hey, do we hire gig workers or not? Do we want to stay with more traditional contractors or not? Now, my recommendation for everybody is lean into it. It is absolutely going to be part of our economy. If you try to fight it, it'd be like trying to fight cloud. But if you lean into it, then you can say, well, let's get the right things in place. Let's talk about where and when we use gig workers so you can educate your hiring managers when it's appropriate to use them. Now we can, so we've kind of talked about administrative controls, right? So there's kind of like 3 different kinds of controls I would talk about. First, that's administrative, giving guidance to your organization about how to use freelance type help, when it's appropriate, when it's not. And here's the things, if you're going to use them, you should do. So that first set of policies. Then talk about your vendor management policies. You still need to make sure they get a contract in place that has all the liabilities. And here's something required by law for most industry sectors is breach notification. So if by chance that gig worker should breach your data, you want to make sure they're obligated to notify you, because that's absolutely required so you can do notification investigation. But if you don't do that in the contract basis, of course, it becomes that increasing threat. You can find yourself on the wrong time of regulatory action. Then we're going to talk about new hire training. Make sure you've got it in that new hire that they get the gig worker. Maybe it's a really skinny down version, but they are actually educated on your practices, your policies. So that awareness training that we do with our employees is still really important. Now, you may even require they use your machine. Now that's typical of a contractor, right? And we're distinguishing a contractor from a freelancer. Often these are such short engagements, they're using their own machine. And sure, you can put in there, you have to have these policies, these things. There is automation you can put in that when they log into your network, you can actually check their machine to see if it actually does have virus control, encryption, some of those things. So that's more the technical layer of controls. Now, the real key thing here is monitoring for this. And how do we know, that they are engaged in a gig contract? Because one of the key things that really bothers me is most of the time we're thinking about this, we're thinking about, okay, I just hired somebody in to do maybe some marketing work or some programming. That's sort of the one edge of the gig. The other edge is just the most scary is it could be one of your fellow employees that's doing a gig assignment. Now, they probably don't intend harm for the company. It's their full-time employer. But then again, they may just non-maliciously leak the data. So we have to put these controls in place and monitoring. Now, the monitoring is the most difficult part because if you used our system, our machine, the same one you use to log in, I absolutely could detect it. But more than likely, the gig user is going to go use a private machine when they're working on the gig. So therefore, I don't have the monitoring pieces in place. So the best control there is going to be user behavior. What you'll kind of watch for in one example is a gig worker, a normal worker will log in, do a lot of intensive work, and then log out maybe hours later. Well, if you start seeing someone log in, check a few things, then log back out, more likely they just came to look at that routine they wrote or download something in their machine that they're going to use. You might spend $100,000 creating a parsing utility for an application code R&D. Well, they need that parsing at the new gig. Do you think they're going to rewrite it? No, they're going to say, well, I did that already. It's in my toolbox. Let me just go get it and I'll adapt it. So that's kind of how these things work. And so when you think about user behavior analytics, that's the one place you can start to see difference in behavior of a normal worker and this person might be a gig worker. Of course, you're going to have to restrict the access rules as much as you can. That they only have access to the data they want to do, that they're going to use. Now, depending again on which kind of sector you're in, so we've talked through some of the administrative controls, the technical controls, the detective controls. So now we're going to think about, well, what other kinds of things I can do? And there's something called virtual desktop, VDI. And what VDI has been around for a long time. And what it does is actually virtualize your whole desktop, so nothing actually gets downloaded. And you'll see it used often in the banking industry, where they're really strict on security. Now, you can implement that to protect yourself on a virtual a freelance worker. But the problem is it's very restrictive, and it usually isn't a very good interface. And while I've tried to implement it a couple of my past roles, it didn't go over real well. The other aspect you can do is called remote browser isolation, where it takes at least that stuff that's in the browser and isolates it. So that's another control where it's not as restrictive as the VDI, but certainly remote browser isolation is another option. Perhaps one of the best controls you can put in place is digital rights management. And what that does, it actually lets you put right in, let's say you've got a PowerPoint or a Word or an Excel spreadsheet. You can actually put rights management right on that so that they can open it, but if they try to share it anywhere or it gets out in the loose, it actually can't be opened because the actual security flows with the document itself. Again, the only problem there is the use cases. If you go back to my example earlier, where it was an application programmer that was, leaking code that they had written and used before, that doesn't work very well in that kind of circumstances.
All right. James, a lot of things to consider and some great advice. And I think the interesting thing you say, which is really great, is just to lean into this because, this type of workforce isn't just going away, now that we're starting to get back to normal. I mean, things are changing and our workforce is changing, so quickly. Well, I really appreciate you being here with me today, James.
Well, I hope you got everything you were looking for. And if there's anything else I can help with, don't hesitate to ask. I really enjoyed talking to you. It's something we do need to talk about because it's sort of that hidden threat that we haven't really exposed. We haven't really put the right controls in place. And it's hard to even talk to executive teams about, hey, that you might have workers, the people that you trust might accidentally do something on the side that could harm the company.
They're not trying to be malicious. It's just,
Yeah, it's a cultural change. I mean, that's the other key thing is we're talking about a culture change. When I entered the workforce, you had a lot of loyalty to the company you work for.
Right.
I mean, at General Motors, people work there one job, 30 years and out, right?
Yeah.
Now, 18 months they're on, so there's no difference between an employee relationship than a contractor when it comes to loyalty. So we can't rely on that anymore. So it's a cultural change that we have to embrace. And this, like you said, and I said, this is not going away. Lean into it, embrace it, understand it, and then let's put the right things in place.
Yeah, excellent advice. James, I appreciate it. We appreciate all of you guys watching here with us today.